Are we there yet?
No.
Are we there yet?
No.
Are we there yet?
Fine. Roll a fortitude save. Today, we're going to talk about exploration mode in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello, travelers and tourists. My name is Mark, and I'm the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who knows a surefire way to get your players to fall into that trap. All you have to do is hand them a map that is very clearly labeled with the phrase, "Do not go here, the monsters will eat you." It works every time. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we're continuing with my Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e series, where we're taking a look at the tips, tricks, and advice that Paizo offers game masters to help them successfully run Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The majority of the content for this discussion comes from the Game Mastery Guide, but we also take a look at some of the tips and tricks that they offer in the core rulebook as well. But ultimately, the goal is to help all game masters, whether beginners or veterans, run better games. And by the way, even if Pathfinder 2nd Edition isn't the game that you play, I still encourage you to be part of the conversation. One of the things that I have observed as a storyteller over the years is that by studying several different games, you can learn different tactics to bring back to your favorite game. So I feel like this conversation is useful for a wide variety of storytellers, even storytellers from systems other than Pathfinder. Also, I just want to say thank you to my buddy Eli, who helped out with the opening for this video. Hey Eli, tell them where they can find you.
Come by and see me at twitch.tv/thebookofdumptruck.
So today, we're going to be moving on to the next major topic for this series. We're going to start discussing exploration mode in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Pathfinder 2e divides gameplay into three distinct modes: encounter mode, exploration mode, and downtime mode. And so far in this series, we've looked at several different aspects of encounter mode. And while we haven't hit every single thing that could apply to encounter mode, we did talk about several of those topics, so the time has come to move on to that second mode of play, exploration mode. As we talk about exploration mode in this video and in future videos in this series, let me go ahead and give you some references that you can read up on. Pages 496 to 500 in the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook talk about encounter mode play, and you can find some additional discussions of encounter mode from pages 17 to 22 of the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2e as well. Of the three modes of play, exploration mode may be the hardest mode to define. Encounter mode and downtime mode exist as extremes. Encounter mode, there is an encounter of some kind playing out. Typically it is a combat encounter, although we did talk about social encounters as well, but there is some sort of conflict being resolved, and there is a heightened sense of tension to encounter mode play. On the other extreme, you have downtime mode, which is a form of fast forward, if you will, a way of progressing the story very rapidly towards a particular goal. But then you have that middle ground, exploration mode. And this is a mode of play that is hard to define because, well, it can vary from game session to game session. Exploring a dungeon is very different from a hexploration style encounter. You have two very different scales of what exploration can be, and that sliding sense of scale is part of the reason that exploration mode can be hard to define. But today we're going to talk about what exploration mode is, and we're going to use this video as an introduction into how to do exploration mode well. This video is going to be a big picture, top-down look at exploration mode, and then in future videos we're going to go into individual subjects about exploration mode. So, let's get started. So, where should we start in our discussion of exploration mode? There's several different places we could begin, but I actually want to begin at, I guess you could say, a point of controversy surrounding this mode of play. In fact, I want to begin with the question, is exploration mode boring? Exploration mode is one of those modes of play that I think has a little bit of a negative reputation at the gaming table as being not very interesting. Combat encounters are interesting because they're very active, and even social encounters, like we talked about in a previous video, there is still some conflict there, so it is still a very engaging mode of play, but exploration mode has kind of a boring connotation to it. In fact, when I was doing the scripting for this video, the channel DM Layer put up a video entitled Travel Sucks in D&D. I'll throw a link to it up here. Now, let me just say really quick that when it comes to this video by DM Layer, I don't agree with their advice, but I still appreciate their video because I think they do a good job of highlighting the main problem that hurts successful exploration mode in an RPG. So, certainly feel free to go and check them out. I think that their criticism of this style of play is very fair, and I think it's applicable to a lot of groups, but I want to talk about how to address that particular problem. In short, in their video, their description of why travel sucks in D&D, and moving that over to Pathfinder 2e, why exploration mode might have this association with just being a boring mode of play, is because, well, usually it has nothing to do with the story. In his video, the crux of his argument is that as a storyteller, we construct particular stories, and, the king needs you to go find the crown of power, and your story beats are talking to the king and finding the crown of power in the dungeon, and the space between the castle and the dungeon is filled with nothing to do with your actual story. And to be honest, I do think that is a fair criticism of travel mode in a lot of different games. I think very often as storytellers, I know I've done this and I know I've seen other storytellers do this, we plot out the different points that we want to hit, and we don't give much thought to how our players are going to move from point A to point B, meaning that when our players are moving from point A to point B, that it's not very engaging. Now, the advice that he gives over on DM Layer is one random encounter per travel session, and that's not what I'm going for here. I think that there are some better solutions to this problem, but I do think we need to stop and realize that travel mode in D&D or exploration mode in Pathfinder is often very dry at our gaming tables because effectively what we've done is we've just stopped the story for a while and we're waiting for the story to pick back up regardless of which side of the GM screen we're sitting on. When we first started this series on the different modes of play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, we talked about how it is important to recognize that each mode of play serves a different narrative purpose inside the game, and if you want that mode of play to be successful, you need to keep the narrative purpose of that mode of play in mind. Now, there are two very obvious types of purpose that exist inside of storytelling. One is tension, and the other is progress, and these two items often have a push-pull dynamic in terms of how they affect a story. The more tension that you find in a story, the slower the story will progress. The story effectively slows down to drive home the tension of the moment. By the same token, the quicker that a story is progressing, the less tension there typically is, because characters are moving so quickly through different items or different places that there's not enough time to really hammer home tension that might present itself in those particular instances. And when we talk about the modes of play, encounter mode naturally correlates to the element of tension, and downtime mode naturally correlates to the element of progress. So for those two modes of play, you have a very clear and easy to understand purpose for that particular mode of play in your game. But again, we find exploration mode right here in the middle. It doesn't have quite as much tension as encounter mode would have, but there's still some tension, and the story is progressing, but it's not progressing nearly as quickly as it would during downtime mode. There's a balance between these two elements, which yet again kind of drives home that hard to define nature of exploration mode. So we need to ask the question, what is the narrative purpose of exploration mode? Tension might be present, but it's not the purpose of this mode of play. And progress might occur, but again, that's not the purpose of this mode of play either. So what is the purpose of exploration mode? Well, this is my opinion on the subject, but I've had a lot of success by correlating exploration mode to discovery. Discovery is one of those beats that happens in stories. Players learn new things, they find new locations, they get powerful artifacts to help them in their quest to overcome the dragon, whatever the case may be. Discovery is an important part of storytelling, and it exists in that middle ground between the element of tension and the element of progress. There's a little bit of both to the element of discovery. So, in my mind, the purpose of exploration mode is to allow your players, in simple terms, to discover things. The reality is, the reason your players don't really care about traveling from point A to point B is because there's nothing to discover or to do along the way. As we said earlier, as DM Lair kind of pointed out in his video, there's nothing going on in that middle ground, so there's nothing to hook our players into the story, and that's the reason that travel or exploration mode, whatever terminology you use, that's the reason our players don't engage with that particular mode of play. The trick to good exploration mode play is ultimately to give your players things to discover. Only in the last few years have I really started to improve in my skills with exploration mode inside of an RPG, but I have seen several different examples at my gaming table of exploration mode actually being a ton of fun. One example that I'm going to save for the Hexploration video is the Hexploration subsystem from Pathfinder 2e. I have had some excellent experiences with that, but that's its own video, so like I said, we're going to save that. But even setting that particular rule subset to the side, I remember one campaign where my players became utterly fascinated with exploration mode play. The setup was pretty simple. The players were in a shipwreck. Their ship got caught in a hurricane. Next thing you know, they wash up on the shore of some uncharted island. I may have been humming Gilligan's Island while I was running this particular story. Anyways, my players found themselves on this island that they had no idea where they were, and they had to figure out where they were and how they were going to get off this particular island. And I let them have a few sessions to kind of get used to their immediate surroundings on this island. And then I let them meet an inhabitant of that island who gave them a map. And on this map, I had highlighted several different locations. I gave some rough indicators of where different monsters might be, of where secret locations could potentially be hidden. I gave them a map that had about 15 different locations on it, and I actually split the map in half. I had a line of mountains going across the island, and they were on the bottom half of the island, and the top half of the island was literally labeled, "Don't go here, there are monsters, they will eat you." I'm not joking, I had that on the map. Guess where my players went first? The absurdity of that moment aside, it was a very interesting moment for me as a storyteller as I got to watch my players' eyes light up. They looked at this map, they saw all of these different locations on this map, and immediately one of my players said, "I want to go everywhere. I want to see everything. If you put it on this map, I want to find it." And he started trying to persuade every single person in my group that they had to hit every spot on that map. They were hooked, and that story arc ran beautifully. And by the way, my players did do what that one particular party member suggested. They made a point to go to every single location on that map. They wanted to see what they were going to find at every spot. You see, they knew that there was something to discover, and as long as there was something to discover, they wanted to know what it was. Now the thing is, some of the locations on that map were part of the larger story that I was telling in that particular campaign, And other locations on that map were kind of side events that the party could run into. Not every location was treated equal, but my players were deeply invested in every single one of them. Why? Because they knew something was there. That particular campaign taught me a very important lesson about exploration mode, though to be fair, this was before Pathfinder 2e, so it wasn't called exploration mode at the time. It taught me that if I want my players to engage during travel, during that particular space of play, that I need to give my players something to do there. So there are a few basic pointers that you can take away from this story and from this concept. Number one is, if we want travel or exploration mode to be interesting in our games, as storytellers, we need to take the time to give our players something to discover, give our players something to do along the way. It can be big, it can be small, but the important thing is, if we want our players to engage with that particular aspect of play, then there needs to be something engaging there. The easiest question you can ask yourself if you discover that exploration mode is boring at your tables is just ask yourself, is there anything for my players to find? Now, once you answer that question, you do need to take the conversation a little bit further. You see, as a game master, there have been plenty of moments where I have put something into a game that I wanted my players to find, but I hid it from them. I wanted them to go looking for it. I wanted them to dig. I wanted them to have to really work to discover whatever it is I had put into the game. And I've kind of learned the hard way that it doesn't work out when you do that. Players can't read your mind. Players don't know where the hidden temple is. Players don't know where the secret treasure has been stashed. And if players don't know that there is a hidden temple or secret treasure, they don't have any motivation to look for it. And so one of the things that you need to do as a GM is, once you have put something into the game that you want your players to latch onto, the next thing you need to do is, in one fashion or another, let them know that there is something that they can find. Now, sometimes you can do this explicitly, sometimes you can do this implicitly, but the point is, you want to put something into the game, into your story, that lets your players know that they can discover something along the road, and that there is something interesting for them to do or find in that given location. In the story where my players washed up on that mysterious island, when I handed them a map that had different locations marked on it, and some of the locations were like, maybe there's something here, by putting something on that map, I gave them an explicit indication that there was something going on. Again, maybe big, maybe small, but there was something for them to find. And it's even worth noting that there were some places on my map that were incorrectly marked, and when my players got to that location, they didn't find what they were looking for, but they found clues that could lead them to the actual location. I didn't have to give them all of the information immediately. I just had to give them enough of an indication that there was something there that they could hook onto and make them want to go exploring. That was a very explicit example of cluing my players in to the fact that there were things that they could discover as part of that portion of the story. Other times you can do things more implicitly. You can drop clues or other pieces of information into a story, and when your players tug at those clues, they might discover that there is more than initially meets the eye. Now, I will admit that this particular example didn't go very well for me, and looking back, I would have added a bit to this scenario, but an example of how I've tried to do this in the past, in one campaign, my players were cleaning oozes out of a sewer, typical low-level adventuring stuff, and they found some dead adventurers down in the sewers who had fallen victim to these oozes prior to their arrival, and most of the deceased adventurers seemed to be fairly standard, what you would expect, but one of the deceased adventurers had a noble signet ring on their hand. And that was my way of implying that the dead adventurer that they had found was actually a runaway noble scion, and that there was a noble family somewhere in the setting who was looking for their missing kid. Now, in that particular instance, one of my players caught the hook, and the rest of my players just kind of brushed it off and didn't pay attention. And unfortunately, they didn't want to listen to the player who's like, no, we need to check this out. And so that storyline that I tried to write kind of fizzled before it went anywhere. And looking back, I wish I'd done a few more things to kind of imply that there was more to that story. But that's an example of how you can drop a clue into a story that can allow your players to discover something along the way that might open up the story in a way they didn't expect. So, when it comes to the element of discovery, the first thing you need to do is you need to make sure there's something for your players to discover, and the second thing you need to do is you need to tell them explicitly or implicitly that there is something for them to discover so that they have some reason to engage and actually chase that lead. There is one last point that I want to talk about. The last thing that you want to consider on this particular topic is, well, the discoveries themselves. Basically what I'm saying here is, it's really easy to get kind of lazy with the concept of discovery. Going back to the earlier conversation, we think of the story as happening in the king's court and in the particular dungeon, and we don't really consider the space in between to be part of the story. Well, when you start thinking about exploration mode and this concept of discovery, you start to realize that this weird sectioning off of the story is honestly not that logical. Who says that there is no story between the king's court and the dungeon, between point A and point B? Theoretically, if whatever is going on in point B is affecting point A, then there should be some impact between point B and point A. What I'm saying is, when we think about this concept of discovery, we should think in terms of, do these discoveries help the story? Now, it's important to note that not every discovery is going to affect your story. There are plenty of things that should be happening in your world that have nothing to do with the major ongoing plot of whatever game it is you're telling. There are a lot of people in the world who have an agenda completely unrelated to the major players in your particular narrative. And I certainly think it is a good idea to have story-neutral discoveries along the way. You meet a traveling merchant, or you have an opportunity to do an unrelated side quest. You definitely want to include some neutral discoveries, if you will, but I do think you should also include discoveries that are related to the actual story that you are telling. Think of it this way. If there are evil monsters in the dungeon, have some of those monsters escaped into the wild en route to the dungeon? If so, you can add some of those monsters that have escaped to your random encounter tables. Or maybe the bandits that your players encounter along the way work for the villain that's holed up inside the dungeon. By the same token, your players could discover something that might help them. Maybe they can discover a village and some of the villagers manage to escape from the villain or have some information about the villain that can help the party when they face the actual dungeon that they're trying to get to. Point A and point B in your story are dynamic, so it's a good idea to make the space between point A and point B dynamic as well. Include things that might hinder the party or help the party as they pursue the major goal of whatever story it is you are telling. In other words, ask yourself, can I include some discoveries along the way that will broaden the scope of my story or otherwise help emphasize some particular aspect of the story? You can actually use exploration mode to enhance the story that you're telling, and as we go further in this series, we're going to talk about some of the different ways you can use exploration mode to enhance your stories. But for now, the big idea that we're working with today is this. Exploration mode can be hard to define because it exists in that narrative tension, in that narrative space between tension and progress. But when we think of exploration mode as having the purpose of discovery for our stories, we find new ways to enhance the stories that we're telling, and suddenly we make that journey from point A to point B a lot more interesting. But let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about exploration mode in RPGs? Do you think that exploration mode tends to be boring? And do you agree with my assessment of why people tend to think exploration mode is boring. Leave your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you have other suggestions on how game masters can make exploration mode more interesting, leave those thoughts down there as well. You can check out my Discord and my Patreon. There are links in the video description. And let me just say again, if you do go and check out DM's Lair, please be respectful. I do greatly appreciate the video that he put out. And I think this conversation about how to tell better stories in this space can go a long way to improving our games. Thank you again to Eli from the Twitch channel Book of Dump Truck for helping out with this video. And thank you so much for being here. Have a wonderful day.